When Joyce Meyer looked him in the eyes and said, "You need to know your place, cowboy," the room went completely silent. Not awkwardly silent. It was deeper than that. Like the air itself had forgotten how to move. 10,000 people sat under the steel lights of the St. Louis Convention Hall, each of them frozen between a smile and a question. The evening had begun like a celebration. A charity conference for veterans, broadcast live. The backdrop glowed blue and gold, the words faith, family, service, printed 20 feet high. Cameras swung across the crowd, catching polished smiles and tearful faces. The air smelled of perfume, coffee, and the hum of money being raised for a good cause. At the center of it all stood Joyce Meyer, precise, confident, dressed in silver that caught the light. Every gesture was measured, every pause timed. She ruled the stage like a general wrapped in charisma. Beside her, Chuck Norris stood still. His suit was plain, the color of midnight. His posture easy but disciplined. The audience saw the legend from their childhood, but he carried no trace of a performance. He didn't play to the crowd. He looked at people the way soldiers look at landscapes, calmly, noting everything. Joyce opened the night with humor, the kind that keeps a big crowd close. Jokes about marriage, faith, patience. Laughter rolled in waves. Then she shifted tone. "You know," she said, her voice bright, "men have a hard time listening to women, even when the truth is standing right next to them." The audience laughed again, louder this time. She smiled toward Chuck, half teasing, half testing. "You may be tough in the movies, but here, I'm in charge." That line detonated like fireworks. Applause, whistles, phones flashing. The crowd thought it was friendly banter. On the giant screen above the stage, Chuck's face appeared, calm, unreadable, eyes slightly narrowed. He didn't smirk or deflect. He just watched. Joyce waited for a reply. Nothing. Silence began to press around the edges of the laughter. It wasn't confrontation, it was gravity returning. Chuck leaned toward his microphone, voice low, unhurried. "Sometimes," he said, "knowing your place means standing where truth stands." The hall froze. It wasn't a rebuke, but the tone had weight, the kind that sinks rather than strikes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Cameras caught Joyce's face, the practiced smile flickering as if the light had changed. Then, professional as ever, she recovered. "Well," she said with a soft laugh, "that's why we love him, a man of conviction." Applause returned, uncertain at first, then obedient. But something in the room had shifted. Backstage, producers signaled to keep rolling, to move on. Joyce launched into her next story, about humility, grace, the strength to serve others. The rhythm came back. People relaxed. Donations poured in through text messages flashing across the screen. Chuck clapped politely when expected, but his gaze stayed distant. Under the lights, sweat gathered on his temple, though his expression never changed. He had been on enough stages to know when truth had walked in uninvited. When the program ended, Joyce shook his hand, smile bright again for the cameras. "Always a pleasure, Mr. Norris," she said, leaning closer. "Next time, I'll make sure to let you preach." He smiled faintly. "No need." The message came through. The flash of bulbs erased the tension for the viewers at home, but those close enough to see the exchange knew something real had passed between them, something neither PR team could spin. As the crowd filtered out, snippets of conversation followed him through the corridor. She put him in his place. "No," he answered her. What did he mean, standing where truth stands? Outside, TV vans blinked red lights into the Missouri night. Journalists already drafted their headlines. Joyce Meyer puts Chuck Norris in his place. He walked past them, unhurried, coat slung over one shoulder. In the glass doors, his reflection followed. Not the action hero, not the legend, just a man carrying a quiet conviction. A volunteer hurried after him with a notepad for an autograph. "Mr. Norris," she said breathlessly, "that line, was it scripted?" He stopped, took the pen, signed, and handed it back. "No," he said gently. "Truth doesn't need a script." Back inside, Joyce stood alone on the stage, the lights dimming, the last chords of music fading into the rafters. For the first time all evening, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not victory, but a thin thread of doubt pulling through her confidence. The audience had adored her as always. Yet when he spoke, the energy in the room had shifted toward him, drawn not by performance, but by stillness. She told herself it didn't matter. But as she stared at the empty seats, the echo of his words refused to fade. Sometimes, knowing your place means standing where truth stands. It wasn't defiance. It was balance. And balance, she realized, could make even the surest preacher feel unsteady. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Joyce Meyer puts Chuck Norris in his place. Famous preacher school's Hollywood tough guy. Clipped, exaggerated, easy to share. What had begun as a joke for a charity broadcast became a cultural spark. News anchors laughed through the segment. Talk shows turned it into late-night banter. Someone on YouTube slowed down the moment Chuck looked at her, calling it the silent reversal. Within hours, it had millions of views. Joyce read the articles in her office that night. Lights low, coffee cooling untouched. Each headline made her smile, but it was the kind of smile that sits on top of something restless. Publicly, she looked triumphant. Privately, she kept replaying that silence. The calm in his eyes when she tried to push him. It hadn't been anger. It had been something steadier. Still, the world adored her confidence. Calls poured in. "You own that stage," one producer said. Another gushed. "That's why people love you. You don't back down, not even from Chuck Norris." She laughed, agreed, thanked them. But the praise scratched at her instead of satisfying. Because somewhere inside the compliments hid the truth she didn't want to look at. That for a few seconds, he hadn't been the one off balance. She had. Across the country, Chuck stayed quiet. Reporters waited outside his Texas home, hoping for a quote. A neighbor said he was seen jogging at dawn, same as always. No statements, no retorts. When someone from People finally reached him by phone, he said just one thing. Real faith isn't about power. It's about humility and respect. That sentence hit the internet like a slow, steady bullet. No shouting, no performance, just truth that refused to die quickly. Threads popped up comparing their philosophies. Memes morphed into debates. Some called Joyce a queen of conviction. Others said she'd been humbled without realizing it. The world loves a fight disguised as theology. Backstage at her next conference, Joyce adjusted her mic in the mirror. Her team buzzed around her. Makeup, notes, the rhythm of logistics. But her reflection didn't look ready. It looked uncertain. She caught herself straightening her posture the way people do before battle. On stage, she delivered her sermon flawlessly. The crowd roared. Cameras zoomed in on her every word. Yet halfway through, her voice caught, just slightly. She pushed through, but the crack lingered in her throat. That night, alone in the hotel, she watched the clip of Chuck's interview again. Humility and respect. The words sounded almost old-fashioned. She whispered them once, quietly, like testing their shape in her own mouth. The next morning, tabloids twisted the story again. The legend versus the preacher. Round 2. Her assistant laughed, sliding the papers onto the table. "You know, this is good for both of you. Maybe you should invite him on your show, clear the air. It'd be ratings gold." Joyce didn't answer right away. She sipped her coffee, staring out the window at the gray sweep of downtown. She didn't like being defined by conflict, but she liked losing control even less. "He said faith is humility," she murmured. "Humility doesn't make headlines." The assistant shrugged. "But tension does." That settled it. Later that afternoon, her producer called Chuck's management. The message was polite. "We'd love to have Mr. Norris on for a friendly conversation, to talk about courage, integrity, faith." It sounded sincere. It wasn't. Joyce wasn't looking for reconciliation. She was looking for narrative, to bring the story back under her command. When the call reached Chuck, he listened quietly, then asked only one question. "Will it be live?" "Yes," the agent said. "Good," Chuck replied. "Then truth won't need editing." He hung up before they could add anything. Back in her office, Joyce closed her planner and stared at the empty page between appointments. The echo of his words, calm, unbothered, returned. For a moment, she wished he'd just taken the bait and fired back like everyone else. That would have been easier to frame. Instead, he'd done what men like him always do. Let silence do the talking. And silence was a language she'd never learned to control. When she stood before the mirror that night, she practiced her smile again, making sure it didn't shake. Her reflection obeyed, but her pulse didn't. "Even strong men need guidance sometimes," she whispered to the glass. testing the line she planned to use on air. Then she tilted her head, hearing how small it sounded when spoken out loud. A gust of wind rattled the window, sudden and sharp. Somewhere below, a car alarm started. Short, impatient bursts. The world outside moved on. But inside that hotel room, her thoughts didn't. They circled the same sentence, the same tone she couldn't unhear. Real faith isn't about power. It was supposed to be a charity event, a simple show for a good cause. Instead, it had turned into something she couldn't quite define, a mirror she didn't ask to look into. And in that reflection, for the first time in her career, Joyce Meyer didn't see a crowd. She saw herself. The studio lights were colder than she remembered. They always looked warm on television, soft, golden, forgiving, but under them, everything felt too sharp. Joyce Meyer stood just off stage, mic clipped to her collar, palms slightly damp. The audience filed in with their usual mixture of reverence and curiosity. Smiles, murmurs, the hum before a performance. She had invited him, publicly, graciously, to clear the air, she'd said. But privately, she wanted something else, control. The last time they'd shared a stage, he'd walked away with the crowd's respect, and that kind of silence echoes too long for someone used to owning every room. Chuck Norris arrived 10 minutes before the show. No entourage, no stylist, a plain dark jacket, jeans, and a quiet nod to the producer. He shook a few hands, looked over the set, and stood patiently behind the curtain. When Joyce finally approached, his expression didn't change. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice smooth, every syllable measured. He smiled just barely. "I figured you'd want to finish the conversation." "Conversation?" she repeated, a little too quickly. "About truth." She didn't answer. Someone called. "We're live in 30 seconds. The stage manager motioned. They walked out together under the bright, humming air. Applause thundered, filling the space like a storm that couldn't decide whether to bless or destroy. Joyce waved, radiant, every gesture familiar, practiced. Chuck gave a small nod, almost shy. "Tonight," she began, "we're talking about courage, faith, and the kind of strength that builds character, not ego." She turned slightly toward him. "And who better to talk about that than a man who's been both a soldier and a symbol of toughness?" The audience cheered. It felt safe again, light, friendly, scripted. He returned the smile politely. "Well," he said, "symbols are easy. Living by what they stand for, that's harder." The words weren't sharp, but they had weight. You could feel the crowd notice. Joyce pushed on, tone bright. "You've inspired millions, Chuck. But even strong men need guidance sometimes." There it was. The line she'd practiced in the mirror. Delivered flawlessly, warm enough to sound kind. Firm enough to remind him whose house this was. He didn't answer right away. Seconds stretched, long, visible seconds. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt intentional. Joyce's smile faltered. She felt the warmth of the lights on her neck, the collective breath of the audience waiting. Chuck looked at her, calm, steady, and said, "Sometimes, guidance is knowing when not to judge those who walk a different path." The studio changed temperature. Applause broke, hesitant, scattered, then grew, rolling forward like a tide that had picked a side. It wasn't the reaction Joyce expected, and the surprise flickered across her face before she could bury it. The cameras caught everything. He didn't press the advantage. He didn't need to. He simply turned toward the audience and added, "We talk a lot about leadership, but real strength starts where pride ends." The audience erupted again. This time, not for the preacher who commanded the room every Sunday, but for the quiet man who didn't need to. Joyce laughed lightly, a practiced deflection. "You've always had a way with words, haven't you?" He shook his head. "No, just with silence." That line landed like a hammer wrapped in cloth, soft, but final. The floor manager motioned from behind the camera. "Wrap soon." Joyce smiled through it, thanked him on air, shifted the conversation back to safe ground. Scripture, charity, family. The audience clapped in rhythm, grateful for comfort. But she could feel it, the shift. The audience was still looking at him, listening differently now. Not like fans, but like students. As they went to commercial, she leaned closer, her voice a thin whisper beneath the applause. "You enjoy embarrassing me, don't you?" He didn't even look at her. "No, ma'am. I enjoy seeing honesty make people uncomfortable." The crew counted down. The red light blinked off. She straightened her notes, hiding her tremor. He stood, shook her hand, thanked the audience, and walked off stage. The exit door closed behind him before she could think of a reply. In the silence that followed, she stayed seated, surrounded by applause that no longer sounded like hers. The producer hurried over, buzzing with excitement. That was perfect. Real tension, authentic TV. Viewers are going to love it. She smiled automatically, but her stomach twisted. Authentic wasn't what she'd wanted. Authentic meant she'd lost control again. Outside the studio, rain started to fall. Not the cinematic kind, just a steady drizzle that flattened everything it touched. Chuck stepped into it without an umbrella. His driver offered one. He waved it off. He didn't mind the rain. It had the honesty that people often lacked. As he walked to the car, a reporter shouted, "Mr. Norris, was that planned? The quote about judgment?" He paused just long enough to answer, "No, some truths don't need rehearsing." Then he was gone, swallowed by the gray, leaving behind a building full of people trying to explain what had just happened. Inside, Joyce watched the replay on a monitor. The cameras had captured everything. Her smile breaking, the audience turning, his exit. It looked exactly like what it was, not a debate, not a rivalry. A test. And she wasn't sure who had been tested more. It started like every viral moment does, a single clip, trimmed by someone with too much time and a sense of timing. The frame froze on his eyes. That quiet stare. The caption read, "When silence preaches louder than words." By the next morning, the video had been reposted on every platform that had a share button. Talk shows replayed it, slowed it down, analyzed it frame by frame. Commentators called it the look. Some joked. Others said they saw conviction. One headline read, "Joyce Meyer meets her match." Joyce told herself it didn't matter. Publicity is publicity, she said during a staff meeting, forcing a smile that didn't fit. Her team laughed, a little too loudly, a little too long. Someone suggested they lean into the attention, maybe sell shirts that said "Know your place" as a wink to the meme. She laughed with them, but the sound came out brittle. The next night, during her sermon in Dallas, she tried to turn it into a joke. "Now, don't go giving me that Chuck Norris look," she told the crowd. Laughter erupted. She smiled, pausing for applause. But under the noise, she felt something different, a strange unease, like the punchline had turned back on her. Afterward, she watched the replay. Her laughter looked nervous on camera. Forced. Her eyes flickered too much. She turned off the screen before the segment ended. Across the country, Chuck was in Arizona, participating in a charity martial arts tournament for veterans. Cameras followed him too, but for different reasons. They wanted his comment. They wanted a reaction. "Any thoughts on the viral clip, Mr. Norris?" a young reporter asked, holding out her mic. Chuck wiped sweat from his brow, leaned on the ropes, and said calmly, "No anger. Just truth. The world's too loud already." The quote spread by nightfall. People began comparing their tones, her noise against his silence. The more she spoke, the more powerful his quiet became. In her next sermon, she doubled down. Her team told her to move past it, but she couldn't resist. "You know," she said from the pulpit, "I don't apologize to men who hide behind silence." The audience clapped, unsure if it was approval or relief. Later, backstage, her assistant looked at her carefully. "You might want to let it go," she said softly. Joyce stared at her. "Let what go?" "The moment," the assistant said, "before it turns into a mirror." Joyce didn't answer. She just adjusted her earring, her expression tight. That night, alone in her home office, she scrolled through hundreds of clips, all versions of the same thing. Different edits, different soundtracks. But the look was always the same. Calm, steady, disarming. She stopped on one video where a commentator said, "You can't win an argument with someone who doesn't need to speak." Her chest tightened. Meanwhile, Chuck kept living as if the world hadn't exploded around him. He appeared at a fundraiser for disabled vets, laughing with them, handing out medals, shaking every hand. The cameras caught him, but his words were brief. "These men and women taught me what discipline really means. You don't need to talk about honor. You just live it." That line, "You just live it," made headlines again. Not because it was new, but because it was true. By the following week, every news outlet had turned their attention elsewhere. Politics, sports, another scandal. But for Joyce, the silence afterward didn't feel like peace. It felt like an echo she couldn't stop hearing. During one sleepless night, she went back to the broadcast, the original interview. She wanted to study it like evidence, to prove something to herself. She hit play. The moment unfolded as she remembered. The bright lights, the crowd's laughter, her voice sharp with confidence. Then the pause, the look. She'd seen it 100 times, but this time she didn't watch him. She watched herself. The posture. The way her smile hardened a half-second too soon. The flicker in her eyes when he didn't answer. The small, nervous breath before she spoke again. It wasn't strength. It was fear. The fear of losing control in front of people who expected her never to. She paused the video, her reflection staring back from the dark screen. For the first time, she saw it clearly. The performance, the armor, the exhaustion of carrying a voice that had to be right all the time. Her phone buzzed. A message from her PR manager. We can still do a public reconciliation piece if you want. Maybe invite him again. Spin it as forgiveness. Joyce typed a reply, then stopped halfway. Her fingers hovered. Then she deleted it. She turned off the phone, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, wind brushed against the windows like someone whispering. For years, she had told people that God spoke through the storm. Tonight, he seemed to speak through silence. And in that silence, pride began to sound a lot like fear. The sun hung low over Texas, the kind of heat that hums through the air like an engine running in the distance. The dust on the road shimmered, a faint haze rising from the ground. Joyce Meyer's black SUV rolled to a stop near a worn-out wooden gate that looked older than the town itself. Beyond it, a small training field. No lights, no banners, just an open patch of dirt fenced with rope and a row of weathered mats. A dozen kids in plain white GIs practiced kicks under the steady rhythm of a man's voice. Chuck Norris stood at the center, calm, steady, hands behind his back. He didn't bark orders, he corrected. A boy missed a strike, and Chuck adjusted his stance with 2 fingers on his shoulder, whispering something the cameras would never catch. The boy nodded, tried again, hit clean. Joyce watched from the car for almost a minute before stepping out. The air hit her, hot, thick, honest. She'd dressed for television, not Texas. Crisp white suit, polished heels that sank slightly into the dirt. She looked like someone who'd brought a press release to a prayer meeting. A few of the parents turned, whispering. Chuck didn't look up at first. Only when the class ended did he notice her, standing by the fence, one hand shading her eyes. He smiled faintly, nodded once. Didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to come, she said. He motioned toward the benches under the shade. You picked a warm day for humility. She managed a half laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. You embarrassed me in front of millions, Chuck. He didn't flinch. I didn't embarrass you, Joyce. The truth just found you sooner than you expected. The words landed between them like heat. For a moment, neither spoke. A dog barked somewhere far off. Wind carried the smell of dry grass and sweat, the kind of air that told the truth about effort. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight. You talk like you have it all figured out. I don't, he said. That's the point. You make it sound so simple. It is. People just like complicated better. It lets them hide. The way he said it wasn't cruel, just plain. And that simplicity unsettled her more than any sermon ever had. He grabbed a towel, wiped his hands. The kids ran past, shouting goodbyes. One of them, a small girl with freckles and a yellow belt, waved up at Joyce. The preacher hesitated, then waved back, almost shyly. You really live this way? She asked finally. No spotlight, no cameras? He smiled. The spotlight's a liar. Makes people think faith needs an audience. She wanted to argue. Instead, she sat down on the bench, staring at the ground. You think I don't believe what I preach? I think you believe it, he said softly. But sometimes belief gets buried under the noise we build to protect it. She looked up, eyes sharp. You think I'm noise? He shrugged. I think you're human. For a long moment, that word hung heavier than any insult. He picked up a water bottle, handed her one. She didn't take it. I came here to understand, she said. Why you said what you did. Why you wouldn't just play along. He leaned against the post, thoughtful. Because pretending makes weak people comfortable. And I've been weak before. Didn't like it. Her jaw tightened. Maybe some people need control. It keeps things from falling apart. He looked at her then, not unkindly. Order without humility is just control. That one sentence landed harder than any rebuke. She looked away, blinking against the sun. The silence stretched. The sound of children laughing somewhere behind them filled the gap. "I thought faith was about leading," she murmured. "It is," he said. "But leading doesn't always mean walking in front." Her throat tightened. She didn't know whether she was angry, confused, or just tired of holding both at once. Finally, she stood, brushing dust off her suit. "You talk like a man who's not afraid to lose." He smiled. "Losing's where the lessons hide." The way he said it, gentle, certain, disarmed her completely. She didn't respond. She turned toward the car, her reflection catching faintly in the window. The confident woman of faith now looking strangely small against the wide, open sky. As the driver opened the door, the little girl with the yellow belt ran up again. "Bye, ma'am," she called. Joyce froze, then managed a soft smile. "Goodbye, sweetheart." When she got inside, the car was silent except for the soft hum of the engine. Through the window, she saw Chuck helping a boy tie his belt, kneeling so their eyes met at the same level. No cameras, no spotlight, just stillness. For the first time, she wondered if that was what real faith looked like. Not speaking, not convincing, not performing, just being. As they drove off, dust rose behind the wheels, swallowing the field in a golden haze. She didn't look back, but she could still see it. The quiet, the children, the man who didn't need words to win. Something in her chest shifted, too small to name, too deep to ignore. For the first time in years, Joyce Meyer had nothing to say. The lights were too bright again. Joyce stood behind the curtain, staring at the crowd through the narrow slit between the drapes. Thousands of faces. The hum of anticipation. The teleprompter scrolled with the words she had written herself, certain, confident, rehearsed. Yet her mind felt strangely hollow. It had been a month since Texas. A month since that dust, that quiet field, that single sentence that still wouldn't leave her alone. Order without humility is just control. She'd returned to her circuit of sermons, her routines, her stage armor, but something had cracked. The words no longer carried the same pulse. Each time she looked into a crowd, she wondered if they could tell. The stage manager gave her the cue. "We're living 5. She nodded, lifted her chin, stepped into the light. Applause thundered, the familiar kind, automatic, loyal, warm. She smiled on command. Thank you so much. Tonight, we're going to talk about perseverance." Her voice wavered, just slightly, but she pressed forward. "About how sometimes the hardest battles are the ones inside us." The crowd quieted, leaning in, but something inside her stalled. The words on the screen blurred. She blinked, tried to catch the rhythm again. Then, without warning, her mouth went dry. Her breath caught mid-sentence. The silence spread fast. Cameras zoomed in, waiting. She tried to speak, and couldn't. For the first time in 20 years, Joyce Meyer stood speechless before her own audience. The stillness was suffocating. Every eye fixed on her, expecting the voice that had always filled rooms with certainty. Instead, they got a woman staring at the floor, lips trembling. Then she exhaled, slow and uneven, and said quietly, Maybe I've been talking too much lately." A soft murmur swept through the hall. Confusion, disbelief, maybe respect. It was the kind of moment no script could predict. The production crew froze. The director whispered, "Cut to audience," but nobody moved. The cameras kept rolling. Joyce looked up, her eyes glistening. Sometimes silence says what sermons can't. Applause came, not the wild, cheering kind. Gentle, cautious, real. She smiled faintly, nodded once, and walked off stage before the outro music could start. Backstage, chaos erupted. Assistants hurried toward her, phones buzzing, managers whispering damage control. Someone said, "We can spin it as a reflective moment. Maybe quote scripture about silence." But she didn't hear them. She kept walking, down the corridor, past the studio doors, out into the evening air. The city was loud. Horns, chatter, the rhythm of everything moving too fast. And then, through the crowd of reporters and photographers waiting by the exit, she saw him. Chuck Norris stood quietly near the edge of the sidewalk, hands in his jacket pockets. No cameras pointed at him yet. He wasn't here for the spotlight. He was just there. Flashes went off as soon as she appeared, microphones thrust toward her. "Joyce, what happened in there? Are you quitting? Is this about Chuck Norris?" She tried to push through, shielding her face. The noise pressed closer, like a living thing. Then she heard his voice. Low, calm. "Back up, folks. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The crowd parted almost instinctively, like water retreating from a stone. Joyce stopped in front of him, shaking slightly. "Why did you come?" she asked. He studied her face for a moment. "Because the world doesn't need another fight," he said. "It needs a little grace." The cameras caught that, the single sentence, the quiet weight of it. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came. The exhaustion finally showed. The mask, the posture, the years of carrying a voice too heavy for one person, all of it cracked. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded once, barely. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not as a savior, not as a victor, just as someone who understood the cost of pride. The flashes exploded again. The journalists murmured. But for that brief moment, the noise faded. Two people stood in the middle of a sidewalk, surrounded by cameras, saying nothing. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than every sermon she'd ever preached. Later that night, the footage aired on every channel. Commentators tried to define it: redemption, humility, forgiveness. Some called it scripted. Others said it was divine timing. Joyce didn't comment. She turned off her phone, closed her laptop, and sat in her darkened hotel room. Through the open window, she could hear faint laughter from the street below. Somewhere, someone was watching the same clip, arguing about what it meant. But she knew. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It wasn't even about words. It was about the moment she stopped performing and finally started listening. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, felt something close to peace. Not because she'd been understood, but because she no longer needed to be. Outside, the world kept talking. Online, the clip gathered millions of views. But in that small, silent room, Joyce Meyer finally learned what silence sounded like when it wasn't empty. It sounded like freedom. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The noise faded. Joyce Meyer's calendar, once overflowing, had thinned. Not because she'd been canceled. The world doesn't cancel what it can't fully define, but because she had started saying no. No to talk shows, no to panels, no to interviews about the incident. She'd gone back to something smaller, slower. One morning, backstage at a modest conference in Nashville, she stood by the curtain, waiting for her cue. The crowd was smaller now, a few hundred instead of thousands. No cameras, just people. The kind who came not for a performance, but for a voice that felt human. She walked out quietly. No music, no thunder, just a microphone, a glass of water, and the soft shuffle of expectation. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was steadier than it had been in months. "A few months ago, I met a man who didn't have to raise his voice to be heard." The audience stilled. "And maybe," she said after a breath, "that's what real strength looks like." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was warm, shared. She smiled, small and real. "I used to think conviction meant being the loudest. That if you spoke with enough confidence, truth would have to follow. But I learned something in that silence. Sometimes, the truth is waiting for us to stop talking long enough to hear it." Someone in the audience whispered, "Amen," not loud, not forced, just honest. She continued, softer now. "It's strange, isn't it? How pride can sound like passion, and how fear can hide in the rhythm of applause." She paused, eyes glistening. "But when the noise falls away, when it's just you and the truth, that's when faith finally starts." A long, quiet applause followed. Not the roaring kind, but the kind that starts slow and grows, steady as gratitude. She nodded, thanked them, and stepped back. The lights dimmed. The stage manager whispered, "That was powerful." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't me." Later that evening, while the building emptied, she sat by the window of her hotel room overlooking the city lights. Down below, life carried on. Cars, laughter, screens flickering with headlines. But for once, none of it felt like hers to control. On her desk sat a small envelope, no name on it. Inside was a short note, handwritten in calm, deliberate strokes. "Heard your talk tonight. You found your place." No signature. But she didn't need one. Across the country, in a rehab center for veterans just outside Austin, Chuck Norris was on the mat again. Not kicking, not performing, just teaching. Teenagers and old soldiers practiced side by side, their movements slow, imperfect, determined. He adjusted their stances, laughed when they stumbled, clapped when they got it right. A news crew had shown up unannounced earlier, hoping for another soundbite. He'd smiled politely, told them no interviews today, and gone back to work. As the class ended, one of the younger men asked, "Sir, do you ever miss being in front of all those cameras?" Chuck tied the boy's belt, pulled it snug, and said, "Power fades. Character doesn't." The student nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the truth. When the last of them left, Chuck stood alone in the gym. The sun poured through the windows, streaking the mats with gold. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, not to the silence, but to the quiet that lives behind it. Somewhere, he knew, she had found it too. Weeks later, a short clip from Joyce's Nashville speech made its way online. Not viral, not explosive, just real. People shared it quietly, sending it to friends with captions like, "This hit different." No one fought in the comments. No one turned it into a meme. It simply existed, like a breath between words. In a world that shouted for attention, it was a rare thing, peace that didn't need defending. A year after that night, during a charity broadcast for veterans, the host played an old interview of Chuck's from decades earlier. The footage was grainy, his hair darker, his voice the same. "Do you believe strength comes from discipline?" the interviewer asked. He smiled. "Discipline's just the surface. Real strength, the kind that lasts, comes from peace." The audience fell quiet. Even through the old static, the message carried. And somewhere in the crowd that night, Joyce watched from the front row. She didn't speak. She didn't clap. She just listened. And for once, that was enough. The camera caught her smiling softly, eyes bright, hands resting in her lap. There were no more battles left to win. No more words to prove. Just two people, changed by the same silence, walking separate paths toward the same truth. And in a world that never stops talking, Chuck Norris won the loudest way possible, by saying nothing at all.